thank you for the brief introduction. My name is André Pacheco. I'm from Coimbra University in Portugal. I'm a PhD student. And today from the paper, I want to only focus on the theoretical part, the juice, so to say, and the part that is interesting to discuss. And the central argument for this paper is to try to understand our identity as humanities scholars, to try to understand the digital infrastructure that we are in, and most importantly, to try to understand our role within that digital infrastructure. And then we can probably start a debate whether or not the most important is the infrastructure as exposed by the designation of digital humanities, or if the most important is our identity as scholars as expressed by the designation humanities in digital. So as it was requested, the topic, the motto for this conference were the scholarly primitives, and they actually provide a good starting point for the discussion. Now, I'm not going to go into detail because we'll probably hear about them extensively throughout these days, but as John Unsworth suggested in 2000, they are meant to act as basic functions of scholarly activity that are common across disciplines and across time. So my interpretation is to see them as basic building blocks of scholarly activity. And one interesting notion we can derive from this is that if we want to analyze the scholarly activity, we can decompose these blocks, or we can look at the blocks and analyze the blocks individually. We can see if they change and how they changed. And if we take, for instance, discovering, it is pretty obvious that they changed. They changed in the method, but not in the essence. Right? Researchers still want to discover, but one thing is for a researcher to go to a library that without any kind of digital support, with just a handwritten note in his hands and say, find. And another very different thing is for a researcher to use a collective database of repositories where he can find his book that he's looking for, is the research, and he can see related works by the same period, by the same author. And we can see that the activity of discovering does not change, but the outcome of that process is entirely different, and it changes the research output. So the important here is that, as we will come back to later, the infrastructure is just a means to an end, and it enhances the kind of questions we can ask, and it changes the context in which those questions are asked. And as Eric Kettler put it, I think we should see it mostly as a social and cultural phenomenon. But we'll delve into this further. So the primitives are not to be seen as something set in stone. They have been revisited over the years. They have been given different names. They have been expanded, changed. So, but I think that at the essence, they are useful to be seen as a conceptual checklist for building new digital tools. And what is particularly interesting about this is that we can infer that if you want to build a new digital tool, you should look at the primitives and see how does that tool improve a particular activity. So the development of tools should not be blind, the end in itself, but it should be anchored on specific needs of research. And likewise, as researchers, when we adopt a new tool, we should just not use the tool just because it's there, but use it consciously and with a critical thought of why am I using this tool? How will it improve a certain aspect of my research? And this is a message that some people sometimes forget. And continuing, the primitives have also been used as a certain creation of boundaries between science. These authors have done some research, and in their opinion, they have, for instance, determined that in humanities, the scholars are more defined by consulting. Consulting as in they talk to each other, they exchange feedback, but then they are the single authors. And according to these authors, this contrasts to the sciences, in which authors engage more in co-authoring, collaborating. And research in digital humanities has been showing us that this is not so true like this figure makes it be. Research shows that over the last years, in digital humanities, people are collaborating more. Each paper has more co-authors. Additionally, Palmer and his colleagues also note that sciences are traditionally characterized by engaging in data sharing. But I also think that this is not so true anymore, because if you think about the developments in data management in the last decade, we think of digital repositories, open access, data management plans. These are all aspects that have affected all fields equally. So even humanities scholars have been promoting and engaging in data sharing activities. And my interpretation of this is that we can no longer simplify things this much. To separate the fields based on the primitives is an oversimplification of a reality that is rapidly changing. And this is not so useful anymore. The digital is bringing everything together and scrambling these primitives. So are these primitives useful for perceiving digital humanities? I think not. So we can ask then, how should we understand digital humanities? What are they? What can we use to debate them? One approach is to first to recognize that none of us really knows what the digital humanities is. And this is a humbling effort that is necessary because it's still something very vivid and very ongoing. And the same way that in artistic movements, we can only understand what they are once we are past them, once we know the limits, once we know what they represented, the impact they had on society and culture. In the same way, we can only understand digital humanities once we are past them. Now, this does not mean that we should not talk about them. We should. In fact, we should even more talk about them, because since it is still ongoing, then we are active participants in this process. So it's even more reason to debate these topics. And one way to debate them is not by providing definitions, because science works on definitions, as it should be, but since it is so fresh, any definition that we would come up with is necessarily incomplete and impartial. So instead, we should probably try to think it more as the values that it encompasses, like what it transmits. And those values are expressed by the designations that it has received over time. And I organize these in the weirdness scale. I know weirdness is not a scientific term, but we can understand weirdness here as in the more weird a concept is, the harder it is to justify it from a scientific point of view. So at the left, we have the most weird concepts, or the concepts that are harder to justify, hardest to justify, and on the right, they become a bit less weird. And we see that the first term is humanities computing, and this is the original term suggested by, in Blackwell's book, A Companion for Digital Humanities, and it puts clearly the focus on technology. Like the authors that advocated this term, they had a clear faith in the ability of technology or the ability of the tools to solve the problems. And these authors were often more concerned with method than with theory, which is bad because it led them to lose some critical sight. And this term encompasses a certain technological determinism that represents an ontology centered on the tools that considers humanities more like a branch of knowledge, but not as the center. And during the edition of the book, they scrambled this term, and instead they went for the term digital humanities. Now, there are many ways to address this concept. The literature shows that one characteristic of digital humanities is that its scholars, they see their identity as being someone who values openness and collaboration, And another important aspect of this designation is that the humanities are no longer an extra, but the humanities are at the center. And the digital becomes an adjective. And when the humanities come to the center, then its core values also come to the center and to the focus. And those core values have been the inquiry, the debate, the critical thinking. And the digital becomes just a means to achieve these values. And I think this is correct. The tools should be a stepping stone to ask more complex questions. And by asking more complex questions, we also get more complex answers. Let's think, for instance, in the field of biology. With the discovery of microscopes, researchers were able to realize that cells exist, and then they were able to research about the cells and create more complex research about the cells. Could they do this without a microscope? Not really. But does the microscope fundamentally change the biology, the field of biology? I don't think so, because the fundamental goal of biology is to understand the mechanisms of life, and whether it is life at the cell level or at the organism level. So the microscope only changed the scope of the questions that can be asked. And I think that in humanities, a similar thing happens. It changes the scope, for instance. If we traditionally read a book, and we read one book by one book, it's a slow reading. But with the digital tools, with big data, for instance, we can suddenly appreciate the corpus and address the corpus, which changes the scale of analysis, which opens up new research questions, but I don't think that it fundamentally changes why we ask those questions.
I think that's your 10 minutes, André.
Oh, okay, I was debating. And therefore, we can ask why the digital? Why are we calling it digital humanities? And I suggest that we can understand it as humanities in digital form, where we drop the digital objective and all the other values remain. And let's see in a bit more detail this. Let's ask, or let's think together, what are the fundamental aspects of a scientific field? The who,
sorry,
the what,
André,
and
would
the
you
why.
be able to wrap up in a second or two?
Yes, isn't it 15 minutes?
10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yes,
Sorry,
I will finish very fast. So in my interpretation, in my opinion, the fundamentals of the field are the humanists. What do? They analyze the products of human culture, and they do this to better understand and impact society. And we see that the digital is just a means of doing this. Yes, it enhances the questions, but it does not change what is fundamentally the field. So, in my opinion, we should just be calling it humanities. We can discuss, you can not agree with me, which is fine, but I think we should be asking the question of why we put the digital humanities there. Because it's not a given. We don't see digital biology, we don't see digital engineering, and we should at least be asking the question. Now, I have some hypotheses for this, but I don't want to expand on the time because I thought it was 15 minutes and not 10. So we can talk about the questions. So please feel free to ask me later if this interests you. And let's continue the debate. Or just send me an email. Thank you.
So, hello, I'm Marijn Koolen. I'm at Humanities Cluster. I'm a researcher and developer. I'm doing this work I did with Sanna Kumpulainen and Liliana Melgar. And thanks to André for introducing many concepts that are very related to the things we did. So we use scholarly primitives in the context of research workflows, particularly around technical infrastructures for digital humanities research. And the reason is that in the Netherlands, we have this project called DARIAH, where we are developing a technical infrastructure to support all kinds of research relevant to the humanities. or that take place in the humanities. But to understand if the infrastructure is actually supporting the larger workflows that these researchers have, we need to see how individual activities together combine into these larger workflows. So we start with a question about evaluation. So why should we be evaluating this technical infrastructure? The important thing is to know, are we building the right thing? Is it actually supporting the things that scholars are trying to do? If we update the infrastructure, does it lead to an improvement or not? And so you can think about individual tools and evaluate them. But if you want to look at this from a more workflow perspective, we should see if combinations and transitions between tools lead to an improvement. So how do we evaluate the entire infrastructure? Now, typically in library and information science, we are very system focused. So our evaluation models look very much at functionalities and do tests on that, make sure that they do what they're supposed to be doing. But here we wanted to take the perspective that I think André was also vocal about, really put the researcher central, look at their workflow. What is it that their processes look like? And think about infrastructural support from that perspective. So that's why we focus on scholarly primitives, because they're a really nice way to operationalize the workflow in digital research, to look at the individual activities and see how they fit together. And only then, once we understand that, to look at how tools link to that and support that entire flow. So we take a very qualitative approach. We interviewed a number of digital humanities researchers, and we asked them to focus on specific research that they had finished. And then we asked them in great detail to elaborate on what they did, elaborate each step, why they did it, how they did it, what tools they used, and also particularly because all the projects were collaborative, who did what and how did this handover work, where one did something and then someone else continued. Now, these processes are very complex and very rich and very nonlinear. So in a way, using an interview to capture this is maybe very reductionistic, but at least it allows us to isolate the main tasks and see how they fit together into these larger workflows. So the underlying idea here is that we start from a real research project as a unit of analysis and gradually extrapolate to more generic use case scenarios to see if this fits a more general group of researchers. So the research questions we had are, what are the correct characteristics of these workflows, of the cases we selected? Are there commonalities in the sequences of these activities or transitions between these activities? And are there particular areas of interest that we don't understand well and that we should think about more to think about improving infrastructural support? So a bit more on the two case studies I'll be presenting here. So both are in the realm of digital history. The first one is on the management of migration flows in Europe in the second half of the 20th century. And the researchers there were interested in how politicians and scientists influence each other and how you can see that through publications. So they took 200 digitized publications of international committees and journals on European migration, and then used tools to extract information about the themes that were discussed in these publications and how they change over time, but also the actors involved, like the authors and the financiers and the editors, etc., how these social networks work and change over time. Second project is on maritime careers in the Dutch East India Company in the 18th century. There they were interested in social mobility and the differences between Dutch native workers and migrant workers. And so they used a large set of 800,000 contracts between individual workers in the Dutch East India Company that were extracted from pay ledgers from several thousand journeys. With that, they could reconstruct careers and then look at promotions and demotions and see how that worked. Now, both of these case studies are very focused on historical research. We have also looked at other humanities disciplines. We published about that a few years ago. So here it's mainly focused on historical research. Now, to study these workflows as activities, we build on top of a lot of earlier work. Some of this was mentioned by André already. Of course, the scholarly primitives, several models have been built on top of that or have been extending those primitives. In our case, particularly the NEDIMA methods ontology that we build on top of, which is an extension which has about 160 different research activities in a hierarchical ontology. So the way we conceptualize these workflows then is that there are activities which are unique and distinct types of mental or physical action. And then a transition is when a researcher switches from an instance of one activity to an instance of another. And the workflow is then a coherent set of these activities and transitions that together lead to a research outcome. The way we did this through interviews is by transcribing them and then segmenting them, and each of us three coding them with the activities that they describe, and then merging our codes and mapping them to the methods ontology where possible. And so this resulted in a codebook, which is available online. And most of the activities we could find in NEMO, and some we couldn't, so we added new activities for that. But then we looked at how these activities follow each other. And so we get these transitions, and then we can actually make a graph of the entire workflow. So that resulted in these two very large and complex graphs. So both projects are very complex. This is very typical. Many steps take place. It's very nonlinear. Although these graphs suggest more linearity than there probably was. So they're very idealized. So you can read them from the top down. But despite the nonlinearity, we could identify different phases here. So in the top, there are this typical initiation phase where they come up with topics that they want to investigate. They look for initial materials. They start planning their work, coming up with hypotheses or questions, things they want to investigate. And then in the middle, you get more analysis phases where they go into the details and start modeling things. And at the bottom, you see more synthesis of ideas and presentation. So working on papers or publications, presentations, etc. So because we have 10 minutes, I can't go into much detail, but I do want to zoom in a little bit on the analysis phase. And I'll zoom in a bit further even for the two projects. So on the left, you see this middle bit where lots of arrows come together in this triangle of reading, extracting, and modeling. And this is something that we found in other interviews as well, in other projects. That what very often happens is that scholars use lots of different sources, and then they bring together a little bit of information into a sort of central place where a lot of thinking happens of how they fit together and how to conceptualize them. So there's a rapid switching between different tools, different viewers, and different bits of information. So this is a core aspect in this project. In the other project, you see this massive ellipse of data validation and reconciliation. So a similar thing is happening. There are lots of activities looping back into this central thing where information is brought together and modeled or molded into something that is relevant to the research questions. So again, rapid switching between tools, rapid switching between resources. This is something that we identified also as a hurdle. So here, researchers struggle or get least support from infrastructure, technical infrastructure. So this is something that we think is interesting to look further into. So one thing that struck us is that in the sciences, this is often presented, these models as pipelines, these workflows. So the output of one activity is the input for the next activity, and it looks fairly linear. Now in the humanities, in many aspects, this doesn't really work because humanities workflows are very exploratory. It's hard to predict what a sensible next step is. So this metaphor doesn't really fit because they keep alternating between all these different activities and tools like the reading, extracting, and modeling. So we thought that a palette metaphor might be more fruitful here to think for technical infrastructure. So what we noticed through interviews and workshops with scholars is that they like to have lots of different bits of information in a single screen brought together so they can make associations, and also include lots of functionality so they can change views and change selections. That better fits with the exploratory nature, where the next activity is really based on what they have in front of them right then and there, and they couldn't predict it much further down the line. So we think this is a more interesting future direction to look at technical infrastructure and how it can support the intersection of activities. So this is all I have time for. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions, but I heard that we'll do that at the end of the session. So thank you.
So I wanted to thank you, the previous speakers, because most of the boring things that is explaining what primitives are have been already said. So I can be very fast on that part. Yes, but okay. So yes, scholarly primitives formulation were given by Unsworth in 2000, and at a conference, a symposium in King's College, and you can see here the very well-known list. But what is interesting to me is just to evidentiate the rationales that were under the definition of the primitives given by Unsworth. That is, my immediate intention is said in presenting this is to suggest a list of functions. These are recursive functions that could be the basis for a manageable but also useful tool building enterprise. So my list of primitives is in no particular order. In fact, the two that seem to me the true primitives are referring and representing. So in a sense, he is saying, I'm just giving a list of activities that from a purely empirical observation are the base of the scholarly activity. And I'm not interested in giving a more theoretical or systematical view of those activities. My interest, in fact, is specifically in giving a list of things that can be used in order to define the design of tools. So it's strictly practical. But it felt that there were the needs to systematize somehow. And in fact, he said, to me, the most basic one are representing and referring, without giving any further specification for that, although in the paper. So scholarly primitives in Unsworth view are considered as basic activities which are common to any scholarly practice. They are encompassing all humanistic activity, research activity. They are independent of discipline and theoretical orientation, though, so there is no change in the approach, in theoretical approach that you have regarding to these scholarly primitives, or even time period. You can trace the history of these primitives since the very origin of the humanities, he was suggesting. And even he at the start of the paper was using a metaphor that is the metaphor of the primitive terms in axiomatic theories as the basis for his development of the concept. And that was quite a different approach, because, you know, primitive terms in axiomatic theories are the basic truth from which you can derive all the theorems, that is the truth on a purely formal basis, that are acceptable in a determined theory. Actually, apart this hint at the start of the paper, there is no systemic approach in Unsworth paper, and the selection is purely practical, and so forth. And he was also aware of this, because in a later interview he said they were just a first list that were useful to give the argument, to start the argument. So why? So we can find such a success in a very let's say, unfinished work. Why did they have such a deep influence, and still they have? Of course, they were very easy to grab because their pragmatist approach appealed to the personal experience of everybody. So it's easy to see what they wanted to refer to. But there is also, to me, a deeper reason. Yeah, they were the oral approach and the notion of primitives were ideologically and culturally consonant with the transition from the evil of humanities computing to that of digital humanities. In a sense, it served as a base for the rhetoric of scholarly inclusivity that was going to characterize the field of the age, and that some years after was epitomized by the notorious Big Ten DH motto adopted in DH 2011 conference in Stanford. Around the same years, William McCarthy and Harold Short developed the idea of methodological common. They were somehow more, so to say, better describing the field, even though there is no deep development of the idea by Wheeler and Harold themselves. They were taken back some years later by a group of scholars in King's College. But anyway, this is just to say that there was a common feeling those years that we had to find a practical definition of what DH is, and in a sense we can also see this in the famous idea of a community of practice that was proposed by Ray Siemens in 2014 at the Zampoli Hour lecture in DH at 2014, when he actually says the community of practice, at least in my experience, has never been divorced from another notion key to what makes us digital humanists, the methodological common. So we see a resonance between this idea of defining DH as an open community of things that are doing things, that are sharing methods, and the notion of methodological common or primitives. And then the evolution has been already said, so we can jump this. So the notion of scholarly primitives has played an important role in the expansion of DH as an expanded field to adopt the Klein and Gold terminology in debates in DH 2016 edition, and in the development of research infrastructure as well. It is now my belief that there is the need to give a deeper methodological foundation to computational scholarship in the humanities, or better, to define the nature and borders of what I would call the core of the DH galaxy, a domain that Michael Piotrowski, for instance, following some recent debates in the community, has proposed to call theoretical computational humanities, and I would prefer to name humanistic informatics, reviving the Italian tradition and nomenclature. And to me, this center, this core disciplinary core of the expanded DH field is a methodological discipline. Methodology is the study of strategies that outlines the way in which research is to be undertaken and identifies the means and strategies of data collection and representation, the methods to be used to analyze and produce new results or knowledge that is something complex to define, the criteria to assess and validate adequacy and correctness of data sets, methods, and analytical results, inter alia, and also how to connect methods and data models. That is quite a problem sometimes. And the criteria to develop theories. That is how to produce a full-scale theory from the very often fuzzy and open theoretical framework that we use in the humanities. Starting from this general idea, I think that in this core, and we can individuate some strong assets and aspects of the methodological and epistemological foundation computational humanities, or whatever we may call it. And one, of course, is modeling. That has been a long study, but it's certainly an asset very important. So to me, most of the modeling must be formal modeling, and you can have a different level of formality in formal models that ranging from mathematical to logical, statistical, and computational. Then we have the aspect of being perspective of a method, the notion of data structure, and this is very interesting. We usually get data structure from generic computing tools or computer science. We do not develop our own data structures, and this is something that has been particularly analyzed by Manfred Thaler in his long activity. He proposed, for instance, the idea of extended data types in order to prepare or produce data types that are apt to get the complexity of humanities objects. And then we have methods, and in this case, methods can be divided into a complex matrix where we one axis is human-oriented computing paradigm and machine-oriented computing paradigm. So we have annotation, text encoding, database production, and even ontologies that are mediated by the human interpretation or activity. Yes. And machine-oriented computing paradigm, where we have the delegation to machine to the algorithms of most of the analytical and even explanation part of the activity. And then this partition is orthogonal to the classical quantitative, qualitative, and the two axes define a classification matrix, and I can go on this because of time. And yes, then we have the problem of how to put together models and methods, and so forth. So, and finally, how we build theories. What is a theory for a digital humanist? In whatever field he's working, as historian, literary scholar, an archaeologist, and so on and so forth, and how we can scale from one level of the formality of a theory to another, if it is possible to. So these are all the issues that I find inside this basket of the new epistemological foundation of computational humanities or humanistic informatics, and that I think we must work on. This is only a very partial and maybe confusing work, preliminary work, and a lot of refining and confrontation with rather recent efforts need to be done. But I think it's of the utmost urgency to do that work on foundations in order to give stability to a scientific domain that has grown very fast in the last 15, 20 years and very rhizomatic, but at the risk of collapsing on itself. Thank you.